Ella had always been a dedicated agent, and this mission was supposed to be the pinnacle of her career, a final, glorious test. But her heart sank as her commander, Whelm, delivered the news. She was being sent to Earth, tasked with scaling an 820-foot OR to install a high-tech device. This device would allow the colony to seize control over Earth's most secure communications, making the colony aware of every shift in global power, every military strategy, and every political movement on the planet. Whelm's offer was clear. If she succeeded, she would rise to command the colony herself. The pride she should have felt was quickly replaced by dread. She hid her fears well, but heights had always terrified her, a phobia she'd never been able to shake. Trying to keep her voice steady, she told Whelm of her fear, hoping he'd understand. But his frown deepened, and he warned her sternly that any refusal would lead to consequences. The weight of his words was clear. There would be no room for hesitation. If she valued her life, she would comply. And so, with reluctance and mounting anxiety, Ella accepted the mission. Still, she asked if someone could accompany her, someone who could help steady her nerves. Whelm surprisingly agreed, though he quickly reminded her that her companion was a human and that any interaction should be kept to a strict minimum. They were to work, complete the mission, and return to the colony without any unnecessary exchanges. The next day, Ella stood before the entire colony, receiving applause and well wishes from her fellow agents. She forced a smile, knowing she would be missed if she failed, but feeling more isolated than ever. With a final nod from Whelm, she entered the transport pod. The only things she had were a small backpack containing rations, the precious device, and the weight of the colony's expectations on her shoulders. Her hands gripped the edge of her seat as the pod began its descent to Earth. Upon arrival, Ella stepped out and looked around. The barren, dry landscape stretched out under an immense sky, the quiet punctuated only by the hum of distant machinery. A tall, solidly built man waited in the shadow of the transport pod. His strong, calm presence surprised her, but he offered no words, just a silent nod. She realized this must be Paul, the human agent Whelm had sent as her partner. Respecting Whelm's command, they walked toward the tower without exchanging a single word. The silence felt heavy, a quiet echo of her own apprehension. The tower loomed larger and larger as they approached. The rusted beams and tangled metal webbing of the structure extended high into the sky, disappearing into the clouds above. Paul gestured toward the first rungs, indicating that she should begin the ascent. Her heart pounded as she reached up and took hold of the cold metal. Taking a deep breath, she began the long climb, feeling Paul's steady presence close behind her. For the first 100 feet, Ella tried to focus solely on her grip and her footing, breathing carefully to calm herself. But the higher they climbed, the more her fears clawed at her resolve. She felt a cold sweat form on her palms, and her muscles began to ache as they reached the halfway point. She glanced back, signaling to Paul that she needed to rest. He responded only with a nod, following the unspoken rule of silence, though his gaze softened slightly as he observed her. They found a narrow ledge where they could sit, and Ella took out her water and rations, offering some to Paul. He declined with a silent shake of his head, his demeanor remaining cool and composed. Ella's frustration flared. They were hundreds of feet in the air, completely alone. Surely, she thought, they could speak without fear of reprimand. She decided to break the silence. "Look, no one is watching us. We're safe to talk." Paul hesitated, studying her face, and then finally relented, his voice a low murmur. "I don't understand why they'd send someone like you for something this dangerous. You're smart, dedicated, and far too valuable to risk your life here." Ella blushed slightly, feeling vulnerable under his steady gaze. There was something in his tone of protective warmth that felt foreign, but strangely comforting. She seized the moment to explain herself, telling him of her ambitions, her hope of taking command one day. "Whelm said if I succeed, I'll be next in line for command. This mission is my chance," she explained, feeling both determined and uneasy. To her surprise, Paul laughed. It was a bitter, humorless laugh that unsettled her. "You really believe that, don't you?" he said, looking away. "Let me tell you something about Whelm. He doesn't have any intention of giving you a promotion. You're not the first he's sent on this kind of mission. You're just the latest." His eyes grew distant, as if recalling dark memories. "Agents like you promising, ambitious, he sends them all to Earth on missions they can't complete. They never make it back." The revelation hit Ella like a wave of ice. Her fingers tightened around the metal rung, her mind reeling. What are you saying? Are you telling me that he intends for me to die?" Paul was silent, his gaze unwavering, but the truth was clear in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Ella," he said softly. "You're not supposed to make it back." Her breath caught in her throat, panic tightening her chest. Every assurance, every promise of recognition Whelm had given her, all of it was a lie. She looked at Paul, a desperate question forming on her lips. Are you going to kill me too?" Paul's face softened as he shook his head. "No, I'd never harm you, Ella." His gaze lingered on her, a silent confession hidden in his eyes. "You're different. I don't know what it is, but there's something about you that makes me want to protect you." Before she could think, she felt herself leaning into him, feeling a sudden surge of connection that cut through the isolation and fear. Moved by the intensity of the moment, Paul cupped her face, lifting her chin, and pressed a gentle kiss to her lips. It was soft, tentative, and filled with a tenderness she'd never known. In that brief, shared intimacy, the weight of the mission faded, leaving only the two of them in their own small world on that high platform. She pulled back, her voice trembling as she asked, "Then, what do we do now?" Paul's eyes darkened with resolve. Without hesitation, he reached into her backpack, pulled out the device that she was meant to install, and studied it with contempt. With a powerful swing, he smashed it against the railing, sending shards scattering into the wind. "We're done with this mission," he said, his tone unwavering. "Forget Whelm, forget the colony. You don't need them. Run away with me." A wild thrill surged through her, a future without the colony, without Whelm's oppressive control. It seemed both terrifying and thrilling, yet the idea of sharing that future with Paul made it feel right. "I'll come with you," she whispered, feeling a strange excitement replace her fears. Paul smiled, his hand slipping into hers as they prepared for the descent. Their climb down felt surreal, the adrenaline of defiance fueling every step. They moved quickly, almost laughing with relief as they reached the ground and sprinted back toward Paul's hidden vehicle. He lifted her into the passenger seat, and they sped off across the open landscape, the flat fields and rocky outcroppings blurring past as they left the tower behind. At his hideout, Paul urged her to grab anything she might need. "We can't stay," he said, his voice urgent. "Whelm won't let this go. We have to keep moving, stay one step ahead." She packed hastily, her heart racing, the gravity of their rebellion fully sinking in. She was abandoning everything she'd known, but for the first time, she felt free. As they sped down the empty roads, the vast wilderness spread out in all directions, a stretch of endless possibilities. The hum of the engine was the only sound underscoring the weight of their silence. Every passing moment, each mile marker, seemed to erase a piece of their past lives. Ella felt a mixture of excitement and fear's strange exhilaration she'd never experienced in the carefully controlled environment of the colony. She glanced at Paul, who gripped the steering wheel with a quiet intensity, his eyes scanning the road and horizon for any signs of pursuit. The hours slipped by, with the world outside shifting from rocky plains to dense forests. Twilight melted into night, and the sky filled with stars. They hadn't seen any other vehicles for miles, just the occasional howl of distant animals in the darkness. Eventually, they reached a secluded area where Paul slowed down, finally pulling the vehicle to a stop. He turned to Ella, the flicker of a smile touching his face. "Ready for a break?" he asked, his voice low. Ella nodded, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and excitement. They were deep in the wilderness now, far from any town or road. Paul grabbed a flashlight, and together they stepped out, breathing in the crisp night air filled with the scent of pine and earth. The silence was profound, a stark contrast to the ever-buzzing colony. Paul pulled a blanket and a small camping stove from the back of the vehicle. They settled beside a small fire he made, its warmth a comfort in the chill of the night. As they ate from the rations they'd brought, Paul's gaze drifted to the stars. He seemed lost in thought, his expression softened by the firelight. "Do you ever wonder what we're running to?" he asked, his voice thoughtful. "I mean, we know what we're running from. But what about where we're going?" Ella wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, considering his question. I think it doesn't really matter," she replied. "As long as we're moving forward and not looking back." She paused, the faint flicker of hope growing within her. "For the first time, I feel like I get to decide where my life goes, without anyone telling me what's expected." Paul's smile widened, a rare warmth in his expression. "I think that's something worth running for," he said softly. The firelight played across his face, and Ella found herself studying his features, feeling a closeness she hadn't known before. His strength and calmness grounded her, but there was also something vulnerable about him now, a side she sensed he didn't often show. Emboldened, she moved closer, their shoulders brushing. He turned to her, and their eyes met, the connection between them deepening in the shared silence. They stayed there, side by side, until the fire began to die. Paul threw a final piece of wood onto the flames and then looked back at Ella, his eyes thoughtful. "I don't know what's waiting for us out there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But whatever it is, I think I'd like to face it with you." In that moment, Ella felt a profound sense of belonging, a rare feeling that this journey wherever it might take them was one she was no longer afraid to face. She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining as they watched the last of the fire flicker out. As dawn broke, they packed up their makeshift camp, the morning chill biting against their skin as they climbed back into the vehicle. They continued their drive through narrow, winding paths, pushing deeper into the wilderness where few dared to venture. Around midday, they reached the edge of a secluded valley, a hidden paradise untouched by civilization. Crystal-clear streams cut through fields of wildflowers, and thick canopies of trees offered shade and shelter. Paul brought the vehicle to a stop, a gleam of wonder in his eyes as he took in the beauty surrounding them. "This is it," he murmured, "a place where no one would think to look for us." Ella stepped out, feeling an overwhelming sense of freedom as she breathed in the fresh, cool air. The valley felt like another world, a safe haven untouched by the colony's influence. They spent the day setting up a small shelter and gathering supplies from the surrounding woods, working side by side in a rhythm that felt almost natural, despite the intensity of the last few days. As evening settled over the valley, they found themselves beside the river, gazing at the sunset casting colors of gold and pink across the sky. Paul picked up a few stones, skipping them across the water with an ease that made her smile. "You're surprisingly good at that," Ella teased, watching the stones skip. He laughed, tossing another stone. "Skills you pick up along the way," he said, glancing over at her. "There's more to me than muscles, you know." Ella chuckled, feeling at ease. "I'd like to learn more," she admitted softly, her cheeks warming. She was unaccustomed to such open vulnerability, but with Paul, it felt natural. Paul's expression softened as he moved closer to her, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Then you will," he said, his voice a quiet promise. They sat together on the riverbank, talking about the colony, their lives before it, and the dreams they'd left behind. She opened up about her fear of heights, her frustrations with the rigid expectations that had governed her life, and her longing for freedom. As the night deepened, Ella leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the comfort of his steady presence. She felt safe with him, a sense of belonging she'd never felt in the colony. He wrapped an arm around her, and they watched the stars appear one by one, the silence between them as comfortable as their closeness. Over the following days, they settled into a peaceful routine. They explored the valley, gathering food, building small tools, and learning the landscape. Together, they constructed a small, modest shelter using stones and branches, a place they could call their own. For the first time, Ella felt a sense of stability and peace, her fears and anxieties melting away in the rhythm of their daily life. One evening, after another day of work, Ella turned to Paul, feeling a wave of gratitude and affection. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything, for taking this risk with me." He smiled, his gaze warm. "I'd do it all over again if it meant I'd end up here with you." In that moment, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, undeterred and unafraid. Their lives had become their own, a tapestry they were weaving thread by thread. And as they sat beneath the stars, hand in hand, they knew they had found something extraordinary: freedom, trust, and a love that defied the past, bringing hope for an endless future.